pourriez réagir au rapport qui a été écrit en partie par M. Dodge cette semaine, qui dit que le gouvernement a sous-estimé les risques des taux d'intérêt élevés. Évidemment, plus le gouvernement prend de l'argent pour financer sa dette, moins il lui en reste pour ses programmes. Et finalement, il n'y en aurait peut-être pas alloué assez pour ses programmes.
Mais merci pour la question. Je viens tout juste de voir un rapport par Robert Asselin et qui a été fait en conjoncture avec David Dodge, qui fait des analyses qui montrent les risques si les taux d'intérêt restent plus élevés, plus longtemps que prévu, que les marchés prévoient. C'est sûr que c'est sage de regarder les risques autour d'un plan fiscal. Et puis, je trouve que l'analyse est comme pour cette raison est utile. Est-ce qu'on va voir des taux d'intérêt plus élevés que prévu? Bien, on ne sait pas. Pour être franche, on voit que l'inflation commence à baisser. On a vu le pic. Les banques centrales, non seulement au Canada, mais à travers le monde, disent OK, peut-être on a un peu plus à faire, on ne sait pas, mais ça achève. Ça commence à achever. Donc, évidemment, il y a des risques des deux côtés. On peut voir une chute dans l'économie plus élevée qu'on pense, ou plus qu'on pense, parce qu'il y a beaucoup des effets des taux d'intérêt qu'on n'a pas vus encore. On va aller voir cette année, parce que ça prend du temps pour la politique monétaire d'agir. En revanche, on pourrait avoir un rehaussement des taux des pressions inflationnistes parce que la Chine vient d'ouvrir. Très bonne nouvelle pour eux autres, mais ça augmente la demande et pourrait créer des frictions au niveau de l'offre aussi. Alors, on verra.
Est-ce que c'est ça que vous faisiez Est-ce que c'est ça que vous faisiez, donner vos conseils au gouvernement, vous présentiez votre état de l'économie?
Mais on a parlé des enjeux économiques, ce qu'on voit arriver en ce moment, et puis ce qu'on voit peut-être venir, et qu'est-ce que ça veut dire pour la politique. Ils avaient envie de parler de l'économie, et puis peut-être je peux donner la parole à mes collègues qui pourraient ajouter aussi parce qu'ils ont participé.
Just before you do, in English, that first answer, can you just recap what your assessment is of that report, whether it's accurate, whether the government really is facing a very pessimistic scenario and has a $60 billion hole in their plans?
So I just saw the report yesterday and had a chance to go through it very quickly. I have a very high regard for the authors. But I can't comment on whether it's accurate or not. I didn't redo their analysis. I think it's useful when we're looking at any forecast, whether it's a fiscal forecast or whether it is an economic forecast, to think about what could go right, but what actually could go wrong. And that's what that paper does. And for that reason, I think it's useful. You know, what people have on their minds is where are interest rates going to level out? And if they do come down or when they come down, how fast and by how much? And so, as I said in French, there are risks on the downside to the economic outlook. Evidently, we haven't seen all the effects of interest rates so far because it takes time for them to act. And you know, many forecasters say it's really going to be in the first 3 quarters of this year that we see the effects on GDP growth and on employment. On the other hand, and that's going to bring inflation down even more. On the other hand, we see China opening, we see still some tightening in labor markets here in Canada, in the US, and in other countries. And so that could mean that inflation stays a bit higher or sticky at a level that's lower than it is today, but still higher than the 2% inflation targets that many of us have. And that because of that, interest rates will either have to rise more or stay higher for longer. I don't know. I don't do monetary policy anymore. I don't know but we'll see tomorrow what the Bank of Canada has to say.
So what is your advice to Cabinet in terms of, you know, how big a slowdown Canada's facing? Or never mind what your advice to Cabinet is. What's your advice to us about how big a slowdown Cabinet's facing?
Sure. I won't share my advice to Cabinet, but I will share some of my thoughts. So I think, you know, in the short run, as Carolyn just mentioned, there are some serious risks for the next year as the economy most likely scenarios, we hit a soft spot in the economy. That's going to impact interest rates, it's going to impact inflation, it's going to impact government revenues and the budget situation. So I think we ought to be aware of those short-run pressures. But at the same time, keep our minds on the long-run challenges that we face as Canadians, and that's things like the demographic pressures of an aging economy, and that's the long-run growth challenges as well. And so I hope all policymakers have a firm focus on those things and think about things that will grow the economy in the long run, while also keeping in mind the challenges we face over the next year.
So given the economic headwinds that they're facing and the commitments they've made on a new healthcare deal which seems imminent and responding to the competitive challenge presented by the Biden administration's new policies, what's your sense, if you can, from all of you, on the fiscal room they actually have and their capacity to deal with that in the short term with these variables without making the fiscal and inflationary situation worse?
Right now, as we look at the new commitments that are being made, we have to wait to see what comes out on the health accord. My suspicion is there's not going to be an awful lot up front on that. It's going to be a long-run deal such that it doesn't have as much of an impact over these short-run considerations. As I look forward to what should happen in 2023, I'm mindful of what happened in the UK in 2022, where they were a bit aggressive on the fiscal side, and it came into a mini financial crisis that they had in the fall of 2022. And so that just suggests some caution of going too far too fast on the fiscal side, because we are still in a situation where the Bank of Canada is paying attention to what happens on fiscal policy. If you go too far too fast, the Bank of Canada is going to simply ratchet things up and make the interest rate environment more challenging. So I think that's something we ought to keep in mind for policy in 2023 when it looks at government spending and revenue.
Can we get you on that, Ms. Wilkins? Would you mind, please? Just giving us your sense of on the fiscal room that they have available with all of these stacking up priorities and the warnings they're facing?
Well, I think Kevin covered it brilliantly. The only thing that I would add just on having a compatible fiscal and monetary policy stance that they kind of work in the same direction of getting inflation back to target, or at least don't offset each other. We did see in the UK, I'm on the UK's Financial Policy Committee, who had to do some programming to help manage that situation. You can just see how markets can react if it's overdone. I think Canada is very far from that kind of situation. At the same time, we don't want more interest rates increases than are absolutely necessary to get back to where we need to go. And one of the reasons is household debt is just so high. And that means that relative to the past when we saw increases in interest rates, the impact on Canadians is just so, and therefore the economy is just so much greater. And so it may seem really difficult now to go through this period of slower growth that we're expecting to see, and be higher unemployment, but at the same time, on the other side, we'll then be in much better shape than if we're impatient. Last thing, on the fiscal side, I don't think all fiscal expenditures are created equal, in the sense that some don't have an impact actually on demand immediately because they're rolled out over time. Others, not only do they increase the growth, but they increase trend growth, that growth that we can have without creating inflation, by increasing the supply, the productive capacity of the economy. And so I would urge everybody, when they look at what government expenditures are happening, to think about it through that lens.
Can you give us an example? Can you give us an example? What is an example of what would be too stimulative right now, that would be working at crosswinds with the Bank of Canada?
I'm not going to give you a specific example. I can give you a rule of thumb. Rules of thumb always get out of date, so use it with caution. But a sustained $5 to $7 billion in spending, according to some models, depending on what the spending is, can be equivalent to about 25 basis points in interest rates. So you can calculate that number yourselves.
Can I ask you, for people who are watching this cabinet retreat right now and they're going, okay, is the government going to come out of this and do something to make life easier for me financially? I'm really feeling the pinch right now. What would you say to Canadians about whether that's a prudent course of action? Like, I just wanted a really accessible thing that the folks at home can.
I think it's most likely over the next year that there's going to be soft patch in the economy. And I think all policymakers should keep that in mind, whether that's making sure that the employment insurance system is ready, whether that's thinking about another round of income transfers to lower income folks in a targeted way. Those are the kind of policy measures you might consider when the economy hits a slow patch.
Are we on track for a soft landing right now, do you think? Like, how do you assess the likelihood of a soft or hard landing this year?
I'm not a great economic forecaster, so I'm going to pass on that one. But I will take on the fiscal report. I agree with Carolyn that it's the authors have impeccable reputations, and I think it adds a lot to have different views of the economy out there. But there are a variety of views on the path of, say, interest rates in the future. I tend to take my guidance a bit from the markets. I see that the 10-year bond yield is still under 3%. So that means that over the next 10 years, the market kind of expects interest rates to be in the neighborhood of 3%. That's not something that really sets off my fiscal alarm bells, perhaps as much as the authors of the report. Their focus on expenditures and making sure that expenditures are well managed is advice I would give to any government.
Ms. Wilkins, do you see us on track for a soft landing, or are you worried about how this year is going to play out?
Well, I'm no longer in the business of economic forecasting either, but I would say that we can expect the economy to slow significantly. We can expect that the unemployment rate will rise, both here in Canada and in other jurisdictions like the U.S., Europe, the UK. Whether or not we'll have a hard landing is something that no one really knows, but I wouldn't rule it out. In any good plan, you think about a range of possible outcomes, of which a recession, whether it's mild or a little bit more severe, is something that we'll see. I think the thing to remember is that to get inflation down, we need time, because that means that the past increases in oil prices will just fall out of the index. They call that base year effects. As demand slows, the pressures on other prices like goods and services will also ease off. I think the question in everybody's mind is, will they ease up enough to get down to 2? Not just steady out at 3 or 4%, without a significant slowing in the economy. And that means, just to give an idea, we have the unemployment rate in Canada at around 5%. Pre-pandemic, people thought that the natural rate, or the NAIRU, where you have unemployment where it doesn't create inflation, is in the 6% range. So clearly, it means that to get inflation down in that way of thinking, especially in services where wage pressures tend to feed into, we're going to need an increase in unemployment.
Madame Wilkins, en français là-dessus, est-ce que vous vous attendez, à quel point vous vous attendez à un ralentissement de l'économie et à des pertes d'emplois?
Mais il n'y a personne qui le sait en ce moment. Ce qu'on sait, c'est que la plupart des effets de la politique monétaire, le resserrement de la politique monétaire qu'on a déjà eu aux États-Unis, en Europe et ici, on ne les a pas vus encore. Alors, ça va venir dans les trimestres qui s'en viennent, en 2023 déjà. Et puis, avec ça, on va voir une augmentation du taux de chômage. Il y a plusieurs prévisionnistes qui croient qu'on va voir soit un ralentissement ou une récession qui est très, très légère. Et puis, les deux sont une possibilité. Ce que je crois, c'est qu'il y a des risques qu'on voit un peu plus que ça, étant donné les pressions inflationnistes qu'on voit encore, et aussi le fait que surtout au Canada, on a une population qui est tellement endettée que chaque augmentation de taux d'intérêt morde un peu plus qu'avant.
I think you also clarified that last point you made about we're going to need an increase in unemployment to make sure that, you know, the kind of inflation doesn't feed in, wage pressures don't feed into it. Can you just clarify what you mean by that? Because that kind of sounds like pretty bitter medicine, like Canadians, get ready, we need you to be jobless in order for us to get our act in order.
It does sound like bitter medicine, and I don't intend to say it in a cold way. The reason I said it is because a lot of the inflation that we see today is because of supply issues, because of past increases in energy prices, and those are coming off, which is very, very good news. there's still a portion of inflation that's seems to be due, according to the studies, to some tightness in some parts of the labor market that are causing increases in wages, or could cause future increases in wages that may keep too much upward pressure on inflation. And so to ease that off, we need to ease off the pressures in the labor market. And typically what that means is a little bit more unemployment. So far, what I see in the forecast isn't a massive increase in unemployment in Canada. It's a lot worse in countries like the UK, for example. But there is some, I think the good news here, if there is any, is that some of that easing of the labor market could come from just companies doing less search for new employees. So those vacancy rates or vacancies, job vacancies that we see are very high. As those come down, that will also help ease pressures on inflation and take a little bit of the pressure off the need for the unemployment rates to rise, as much as it might have had to do in the past when we saw inflation get as high as it is today.
Thank you. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Hey,